off.
Awesome. Okay. So welcome to tonight's Wetland Appreciation presentation by the Rideau Roundtable and the Rideau Environmental Action League. This is being recorded. So if you don't want your video to be on the recording, kindly turn off your video. So the Rideau Roundtable is an incorporated not-for-profit association of individuals, community groups, business groups, and other partners and government organizations. Its focus of activity is the sustainable use of the Rideau and Cataraqui waterways and watersheds. And the Rideau Environmental Action League is a registered charity which conducts community-wide environmental projects and promotes environmental improvements within the town of Smith Falls and the Lanark, Leeds, and Grenville counties. So tonight, we're going to have a few different speakers. The first one will be Simon Lunn. He is a biologist, naturalist, and retired ecosystem scientist, and he's going to speak to us about the various forms of wetlands we find, as well as the wildlife that we will find in these wetlands, specifically centered around the swale in Smith Falls. And then Andrea Howard is a naturalist canoe guide and is also locally known as the Merrickville Bug Lady. So she's going to speak to us about insects and arthropods that we would find in a wetland. And then myself, I'm Jake Wilson. I'm a naturalist, canoe guide, and environmental project coordinator for the Rideau Roundtable. I'll talk about some various plants that we'll find in a wetland and some of the benefits that wetlands provide for us in the ecosystem, as well as some challenges they're facing and how we can help. So this presentation is to generate a deeper awareness of the rich biodiversity of different plants and wildlife we find in a wetland, as well as to become more aware of some of the benefits that we receive from them. Wetland, for your information, refers to any land that is permanently or temporarily submerged in or permeated with water. So by this definition, freshwater marshes and saltwater marshes, wooded swamps, bogs, seasonally flooded forests, sloughs, and peatlands are all considered a wetland. So with this, I will hand it over to Simon to listen to types of wetlands and some wildlife.
Thanks, Jake, and hello, everyone. So we're talking about wet places, but very special wet places. And I have to admit, it's one kind of ecosystem that particularly gets me going. It's wonderful to discover the incredible biodiversity within wetlands that we have right on our very doorsteps. And Jake already mentioned what most classification systems say are wetlands. Bogs, fens, swamps, and marshes are the main ones. But of course, there are all kinds of variations of each of these. The first one I'd like to mention is bogs. Bogs are, they're not very nutrient rich. They're covered with covered areas, wet areas, depressions with kind of a high water table. They rely on a lot of water coming through rainwater and whatever shows up with surface runoff running into a bog area. And as many of you are familiar with, they have a surface carpet primarily of sphagnum mosses, but a few other kinds as well, and the other plants like specialized orchids and so on. They have a lot of surface hummocky areas, certainly sphagnum bog. If anybody's ever bounced off sphagnum moss, it's kind of fun, as long as you don't get carried away because it can really damage a bog habitat. They have very acidic waters, as I said, near the surface, and very few nutrients. They have low oxygen saturation. They may or may not have trees, and as you can see in this picture, moose tend to love bogs as one of their habitats they visit. So next we talk about fens. Now both bogs and fens are not that common in this particular area. You'd have to go to a place like near the Limerick Forest in Merrickville for a bog, an example of a bog area, but also up in towards McDonald's Corners region, there's the Purdon Fen or Purdon Bog as it's sometimes called. And fens are very specialized. They have very limited movement of water. They rely on water that comes from surrounding slopes. They have less acidity in the water, and they're a little more productive in terms of plant life and a certain number of animals, including a lot of insects. So the Purdon Bog would be one of the best local examples with their showy lady slippers, which are quite a sight, and a boardwalk around that makes it easy to view. Then we have swamps. Now, swamps are actually very common types of wetlands. They're located throughout this area, and basically in most cases you're talking about a wet woodland that has water inundating the area to various depths, usually fairly shallow, a series of channels or pools of water, very slow flowage, and found in low-lying swampy areas. Now, in this localized region of Ontario, you find hardwood swamps that typically have tree species like silver maple, elm, red maple, those kinds of trees. And unfortunately, up until now, fortunately, many ash trees, but you know what's happening to ash trees these days. Very productive areas, not very acidic, more on the alkaline side, and they may or may not have water and saturated soils all through the season. Next are what most people would regard, I think, as the most common, most recognizable type of wetland area. Very, very productive. In fact, when you're talking about wetlands such as marshes, they're on a scale not quite as high in terms of biomass production of living organisms. And also when you talk about productivity in general, not quite as much as, say, coral reefs in various parts of the world, or tropical rainforests, because those kinds of ecosystems are right up there, incredible biodiversity. But marshes and wetlands, many of them in general, are still right up there, and much more productive in terms of comparing them to many of the best kinds of agricultural crops in terms of producing plant life and so on. But there's not just those kind of four major types or kinds of wetlands. You have variations that I mentioned. You have areas like this, a kind of a wet meadow, or when you're in a closed canopy forest, you have all these springtime or vernal pools that are wetland types of wetland. As Jake mentioned, you have coastal wetlands. In this case, it's the salt marsh, South Shore, Nova Scotia. And of course, the Great Lakes, you have many coastal wetlands, but in a freshwater habitat. You have various varieties of wet meadows. This is a small stream floodplain with all kinds of marsh marigold in it. You have areas that have been engineered by nature's natural engineer, the beaver, for better or worse. They actually take areas that were once drier and with their activities end up creating, to a certain degree, different types of wetlands. Here you can see this is a beaver produced partial wetland along the Rideau Trail in Murphy's Point Park. And here is a great one to see, a great type of wetland, a lot of colorful plants, very interesting to walk through at Charleston Lake Provincial Park. It's another example of a type of wetland, in this case in a bay of a lake. But as Jake mentioned, we're heading to the swale. It's the kind of place that, you know, there are good times to visit habitats like this, and then there are really great times to maximize your chances of encountering animals. And that's what gets my juice going. Every time I take a canoe or a kayak out to a wetland marsh, especially the swale, I'm never disappointed, always discovering something new. And let's take a look here at the Smiths Falls. On the left side, you can see this is Smiths Falls detached, looking west towards Punamali and Lower Rideau Lake. And in the foreground, that whole complex is part of the swale wetland. And on the right-hand side, you're viewing in the opposite direction towards Smiths Falls, and again, a part of the swale wetland. And this is an example of a marsh that has a real complex mixture of floating islands, embedded parts of land, and a real incredible mixture of different mini habitats within that wetland. Now, this doesn't happen to be within the swale directly. This is Brazil's Creek up near Burt's Rapids, but it shows you, similar to what the swale has, is large floating areas of water, or open, semi-open areas of water. More open in the spring, and then once the plants start growing, here you end up with a floating, well, what some people would call kind of a biological supermarket. I call it a buffet, a natural buffet of wonders that you can discover paddling through, visiting a place like this. You find all kinds of life, and everything from the common great blue heron. Occasionally you'll be lucky enough to see one actually catching a fish, like a sunfish. And true enough, great blue herons don't necessarily always, or a lot of the time, they don't directly nest in a wetland necessarily. They do in some areas, but more often I think most people would see them along shorelines, and they certainly, like so many animals, birds especially, make use of a wetland area for parts of their life cycle. In this case, it's incredible what you can discover when you visit a colony of herons, unless you're too close and get regurgitated on with what they feed their young, fish and so on, you can imagine. But you can find anywhere from 1, 2, 3 nests up to, in the old days, you used to find as many as 400 or 500 nests because they're colonial birds, and they nest in flooded areas, and they visit those nests and build them up higher and higher and wider year after year after year. The first year of building a nest, a heron may have a nest about 20 inches wide, and barely a few years later, they can be as large as 4 feet wide after quite a few years, and 4 feet deep. They're quite the characters. But of course, some of us, many of us, maybe all of us, are familiar with another visitor that tends to nest in areas, whether artificially built nests by the likes of Ontario Hydro, community groups, landowners to try and get them to nest there, or away from hydro poles in some areas, or just naturally nesting ospreys, in this case, in trees adjacent to wetland areas. They're an apex predator right at the top, and as you can guess, a lot of fishing. Some of the neat things about a bird like the osprey is that they have a special 3 claws or toes in the front and 1 behind, and it enables them to grasp a fish, and in many cases hold on to it in a streamlined fashion while they're flying. And in fact, ospreys will sometimes feed on a fish as in flight. Now, of course, they may be an apex predator, but they're quite susceptible to other aggressive intruders trying to protect their territory. In this case, a red-winged blackbird. And probably the red-winged blackbird is one of the most iconic or representative birds of a marsh area like the swale. And I think Jake may have a call that he's going to share with us.
Speak about it, and then I'll share the call.
Okay. Well, the red-winged blackbird, very common. Wetlands aren't the only area that they inhabit, but they certainly prefer it. And they love nesting near each other. One male will have as many as 10 females that he introduces himself to and considers a partner. So they're quite the characters, and can be in their own rights aggressive way beyond their size. Go ahead, Jake. We're trying this out. The sounds may or may not work. Yeah. Okay, well, I think most of you would be familiar with a red-winged blackbird call. We'll move on to another bird that has a very distinctive call. And although not in most people's radar, most of you would have heard of house wrens, winter wrens, maybe even. There's a whole family of various species of wrens that we have. A tiny little bird that projects its voice way beyond its size. And they're incredible birds. They're very representative of marsh ecosystems, including the swale in particular. They'll build upwards of between half a dozen and 20 nests just to attract a female when they first arrive on the breeding territory. They'll build the shell of a nest, and it's up to the female that they may entice in to choose which nest it's going to decide to use and bond with that male, and then the female will then add lining and so on. They're amazing little birds, and I don't know if Jake's can try the call of this, but the marsh wren in this case is a very distinctive little bird that hangs around cattail areas.
I am going to give it a shot.
Well, doesn't sound like we're going to hear it, so we'll move on. From a size point of view,
Actually,
carries well.
the rest of us are hearing that, you know. At
Oh,
least-
you are? It's just
Yeah.
me. Okay. So, well, that wren call, if everybody else is hearing it, thank you for telling me, is a kind of a staccato-like call, and very different from the house wren. The winter wren, for example, is another little wren that hides in the woods versus being heard in gardens of residential properties. The winter wren has a very musical, fluid song. The marsh wren is a series of kind of harsh notes, but again, it's very, once you learn it, that's when you can hear how many marsh wrens there are in an area like the Swale. So here we have a little piebald grebe, one of my favorite birds in a marsh area, including the Swale. Many of these photos were taken directly in the Swale area. They're a little different from ducks. They sort of look like a duck, but they're much smaller. Their calls are very loud. We'll have Jake play that in a moment. And like many birds, as in frogs and other animals, the lower frequency sounds tend to carry the furthest distance-wise. These birds sing with a volume way beyond their size, and you can hear them. There are several territories within the Swale, probably a dozen or more just within part of the Swale area itself. And they're neat birds because instead of like dabbling ducks, tipping their bum up in the air, they tend to go underwater like a submarine, a periscope, straight up and down, because they're able to trap extra air, oxygen in their flight feathers and have better control of going up and down, just like a submarine's periscope. And they nest on the water. They look for floating areas of submerged vegetation or dead vegetation and build a nest right on the water. And here we are in the Swale, where you're dealing with a wetland area. This is one of the benefits of partially controlled water levels, like the Rideau Canal attempts to do as best as they can to foster wildlife. The variations in water levels are not as drastic as they might be in natural rivers and other areas that are uncontrolled. And as a result, you often have better nesting success in birds like this, like the piebald grebe that nest right on the water surface. And you can see that the young that they carry in on their backs, just like loons do with their young ones, they're very differently colored for the first week or two. They're very precocious and a great bird to see and discover within the reeds. And here's an example of another poorly known bird. This is the equivalent of the white colored common tern that some of you may know. They're birds that look like miniature gulls, but much more streamlined. This is the black tern, and they're more uncommon. They're a species of special concern. They're special birds that nest within marsh areas in very loose, scattered colonies of just a few birds at a time. But as you can see, very similar nesting situation, as many of the marsh birds do in a marsh area. There's a black tern on the left and the common tern on the right. Now here, of course, we have a very special bird, a master of camouflage, as you can see on the right, the American bittern. On the left, you can see that the camouflage doesn't always work in certain situations, but very intriguing birds. Again, a very loud pump-like call, very different from this bird that most of you may not be familiar with, also found in the Swale. Surprisingly good population of them, called the least bittern. About 2/3 of the size of an American bittern. This is a male, very colorful, but if that bird as you'll see in a moment, face towards you, you'd see that camouflage streaking pattern, just like the American bittern. Least bitterns are also a species at risk, although I think there are probably a few more out there than some earlier studies indicated. The jury's out on it, but they're very secretive birds. And if you're there in a marsh area, as is the case with so many other bird species, if you're there in the early morning or maybe the late early evening, you have a much better chance of seeing a bird like this, the least bittern. Here's one sitting on its eggs right there near the Basque-Gill Bridge in the swale at the edge of the floating marsh section. Within that general family of rails, coming up, this is a Virginia rail. Again, a very loud call, a very secretive but curious bird. It's one of those birds that unless you spend some time in, looking for this kind of creature in a marsh area, you may never realize it's there. I did an amphibian and marsh bird survey one time, which involved, there's an official survey, playing back bird recordings. And I played the call of a Virginia rail just 3 times. And all of a sudden, here comes this rail stalking through the cattails and the reeds towards me. And it actually came up, I was sitting on the ground with my legs forward, and it actually started pecking on my foot. That's not something you can expect, but it's one of those special encounters, and all it may take when you visit a special area like this is one special encounter like that and gets your interest. So the Virginia rail is one of a group of birds like this one here. It used to be called the common gallinule and now called the moorhen, the common moorhen. Look at the size of those toes, those feet, specially adapted, very colorful bird in many respects, specially adapted to walk on the tops of lily pads as they're floating and along shores and sometimes swimming. But an area like the swale wouldn't be the same without the wood duck. A male on the left, very colorful, sexually dimorphic, where the males are much more common or much more colorful than the females, as is the case in most bird species, but not all. The kingfisher is the opposite. The females have more color. But here, these wood ducks, every year I see broods of them in the swale. They nest in holes in trees, and it's one of those birds that you can actually put a wood duck nest box up on a tree as high as sometimes as their young will pop out of there once they're born and jump 30, 40 feet, as long as it's the ground isn't too hard, and then scuttle off to the closest body of water, led by their parents. This is a female wood duck, and it happens to be a nest box in my backyard. But of course, if you think of what would you say is the most common waterfowl or duck in North America, and for that matter, very cosmopolitan species, the mallard. They lay up to at least 12, 15 eggs. In fact, other ducks will sometimes lay their own eggs in the mallard duck's nest. These nests may be found at the edge of a wetland, in areas with floating islands within a wetland, but more often than not, if there are adjacent fields, agricultural areas with hay fields, they'll nest somewhere within that field, within, reach of the water. And the young are very precocious, like so many marsh birds, waterfowl especially. They're ready to get up and go and start swimming right off the bat when they're born. Now here we get into just quick mention of a few other types of species, non-bird species. You have the hurump calls in the early evening hours of the bullfrog on the left-hand side here. And on the right, what is probably the more common call when people say, what does a frog sound like? Well, a ribbit call, much fainter call, more high pitched, doesn't carry as well, but that's a green frog all right that has that kind of call. They look very similar in certain ways, but you can tell the difference because the bullfrog has a ridge that curls around both of its ears, that big tympanum membrane that you see on the green frog there. The green frog is different. It has ridges down its back and not curled right around that eardrum. There are other frog species that we have, leopard frogs and so on. But of course, turtles are another feature of wetlands. Painted turtles, very common. And here's a tip: if you have a shoreline property and you've got an area that won't interfere with navigation, it's always a good idea, if there are existing logs or rocks or whatever along the shoreline in the water, animals like turtles depend on basking areas like this, and it's a good idea to leave them. Or if you don't have anything and you can put a floating log rooted to the bottom that won't interfere with navigation, to give them a place to bask. It's a great idea to do for ducks, turtles, all kinds of wildlife. And certainly wetland areas are heavily used by snapping turtles, painted turtles, Blanding's turtles, different types of wetlands. And then all they have to do is usually crawl up a sandy bank, like at the Bastille Bridge on the old railway line. You'll see a dozen or more old nests that, where snapping turtles and painted turtles have laid their eggs. And here's a Blanding's turtle, much rarer turtle, very special. Reminds me a little bit of the carapaces, like a World War I German soldier's helmet, and that bright yellow neck that sticks out. They're much more secretive. If you show any movement approaching one of these, they'll scuttle into the water really quickly. But this is one area of Eastern Ontario in Canada where they're quite common here, as far as you'll ever find them common anywhere. And to end it off, this section, I just wanted to mention, of course, you've got a whole suite of mammals that are creatures that frequent, like this mink, the shorelines of a wetland, a beaver, and again, nature's engineer, creating so many wetland areas and enjoying the wetlands that we exist, and very similar muskrats that are certainly common within the swale and visiting areas. So I'm going to pass it on to Andrea to talk about insects and arthropods, I believe. And this loon bids you farewell. And this young one did survive. It was able to crawl back in the nest. And thank God for seeing the sights of loons and so many of these creatures in our wetland areas and locally. Go for it, Andrea.
Thank you, Simon.
Andrea, just before you start, is anybody else having a problem where the pictures are out of sync with what Simon was saying?
Yes.
There is a
Yeah.
delay between when we
There's a
click.
delay.
Okay, I just was wondering because, yeah, that's fine. So as long
Okay.
as not just me.
It's not you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Share. So I am here to talk to you about wetland insects. I won't get into the other arthropods too much. Suffice it to say that insects are in a larger group of animals called arthropods, arthroarthritis, animals with jointed legs. And they come with 8 legs, many legs, and 6 legs, which is the insects. So now I've got 2 computers going. Let's see if I can sync. Of the 104 million, 1.4 million identified species in the world, 3/4 I've heard, and half I've heard, a whole lot of them. The vast majority are insects. Among the insects, the beetles take the cake. Famous geneticist J.B.S. Haldane said the creator, if he exists, has an inordinate fondness for beetles. There are more species of beetles than there are of all other insects combined. It's really quite remarkable. And one of the reasons that there are so many is because they are specialists. They have biting, chewing mouth parts, and they are able to eat any number of things, from decaying plants to fresh plants to mushrooms, fungi, slime, other animals, other insects. They can bite and chew just about anything. And so they are highly specialized, and they live gazillions of them in the tropical rainforest, you can imagine. The name of the beetle order of insects is Coleoptera. Coleoptera. Ptera, P-T-E-R-A, means wing in Greek. Coleo means sheath, covering. So you'll notice that beetles have a hard wing cover that meets in the middle, two halves, perfectly symmetrical. These wing covers meet in the middle, and it looks like a tuxedo. So if you see an insect that looks like it's wearing a tuxedo, then that is a beetle. Beetles can also fly by lifting that wing cover, and then a diaphanous wing unfurls underneath, and they are quite ungainly when they fly, but they are able, and then when they land, you know, the underwing folds up and the wing cover comes in. And that is unique to the beetles. Here's the aquatic beetles laid out. This one on the bottom left is the big predaceous beetle, diving beetle. All of these beetles tend to lay their eggs on or near water, and their larvae are aquatic, but they will come out of the water to pupate, and then they will go back into the water as adults. And they all breathe oxygen and have a number, they breathe air, which is to say everybody breathes oxygen. And so they will capture air in bubbles and dive. And sometimes they'll capture air under their wing covers, and that can keep them going for quite a while as well. And different aquatic insects have different places to squirrel away these air bubbles. Disticus, Ditiscus, there we go, is able to dive. So this is the large predaceous beetle. The larva is quite a creature for this beetle, I must say. It has, whereas the adult has chewing mouth parts, these pincers that you see coming out of the head of the larva actually pierce and inject a pre-digesting serum that allows them to do a little sucking, which is something that beetles don't normally do. That's restricted to the true bugs, and I'll tell you more about that later. Suffice it to say that this predaceous diving beetle larva is really not something you want to meddle with. I can't see because my screen, my meeting screen is in the way, but I guess, can you see the minnow there? Yes, okay. Another diving beetle that is far less sinister is this cybister. It's a little more colorful. Its larva is less aggressive, and it's not likely to take a bite out of you. These are all beetles that you'll find in Canadian waterways. There are scavenger beetles as well that crawl around on the bottom and eat dead things. They are, like the others, attracted to lights, and you might see them flying at night. You might see them gathering on city streets or in playing fields because they are attracted to the light and might be looking for mates. Sometimes they go to different water bodies to check out the food supply. A smaller scavenger beetle. The larva of this scavenger beetle, though, reminds me of something. Who does that remind you of? Does anybody know what I was thinking when I saw this? Aha! The sand eel from SETI Alpha 5 in Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan. Clearly, once again, an extraterrestrial creature is modeled on an actual animal. And there's nothing like the insect world to provide you with excellent examples of really weird creatures. The whirligig is a little beetle as well. It has an interesting adaptation. It's got those long front legs are actually for grabbing onto its prey. It uses the middle and back legs to whirl around. You see them in masses, whirl around all together. Sometimes they might be mating there, but a lot of the time they're just hanging out. And the ones on the outside get dibs on food. So there's an advantage to being on the outside, but then the ones on the inside are not likely to be predated. So there is safety on the inside. The females actually in a study tended to go to the center and the males to the outside. These beetles have a fascinating adaptation. Oh, hey, my cursor can be seen, right? There are two pairs of eyes that look up and two pairs of eyes that look down into the water. It's really kind of cool. Yes, so that's them. Let's see, now we get into the true bugs. True bugs, unlike the chewing beetles, true bugs have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So true bugs in the order Hemiptera, suborder Heteroptera, is a little, it's in flux, is complicated. But we'll call them Hemiptera for now, hemi meaning half or hetero meaning different. If you look at the images, you'll see that these insects do not have a straight line down the middle like the beetle does. They have an X. So those wing covers lift up as well. The fluffy wings unfurl and fly. And when they fold back up again, the wing covers close up in a cross, an X, like they crisscross over one another. And so that is how you can tell you're looking at a true bug. And those piercing, sucking mouth parts can do a fair amount of damage. Fortunately, the water boatman sucks plant matter, so it's not going to be after anything, any part of you. Loud, I've pointed out here, there are recordings. I have one actually. I don't know that I could successfully share it, of these guys. They use their anus, would rub it against a part of their abdomen, and they make a chirp, like a cricket chirp. And you can hear it even from underwater for like kilometers around. Apparently they are, for their size, one of the loudest creatures in the animal kingdom. You know, they can hold their own against elephants, just in terms of proportion, you know. The other very similar, take a water boatman who's on his stomach and flip him over and you've got a back swimmer, but they are a different family. And back swimmers are actually carnivorous, and so they can bite humans. And when I say bite, here's what they do. Here's a nice picture of the water strider, also a true bug. You can see in this blow up here, there's this tube here. It's like a beak, you can call it a beak, and it's cone shaped, and it's normally tucked under the chin. When it's deployed, it comes up and it sticks into whatever is going to be eaten. And out of it comes a tongue and possibly some other appendages, I'm not sure how many. And the bug injects this pre-digesting enzyme into its prey, liquefies the inside of it, and then sucks it empty. And it's really quite a remarkable feeding strategy, which is particularly gruesome in the giant water bug. The giant water bug, as you can see, is big. It's like 4 centimeters. It's big. Also known as a toe biter. Those front legs are used for grabbing prey. And this poor young frog is not long for this world at all. And it will do that piercing, injecting thing and pre-digesting it. But there's also a paralytic agent as well. Unfortunately, there's no anesthetic. So this is not a bug for playing with. You see these also on playing fields and on city streets. So this brave person has picked it up. I have held one. You can hold it by its bum or by its sides, but you know, this is asking for trouble here. And look at the size of the thing with the wings deployed. And do you really want to face that face? So they're all over the world. They're water scorpions in other parts of the world, and maybe not as big as we have here, but clearly not a bug for playing with. As desserts, on the right, we can see that in Southeast Asia, they are a delicacy. And surprisingly, they are good parents. The female will lay her eggs on the back of the male, or possibly in a little raft on the near the shore, and the male will squirt them and keep them moist and supervise them and protect them from predators. So good news, bad news bug. The dragonflies and the damselflies are in an order Odonata, and they are in something that's called an infraclass Paleoptera. Paleo means old, right? So the dragonflies, damselflies, and mayflies are three species of three families of insects that have been around since before the dinosaurs. So I've just got some images, pretty ones. The difference between the dragon with his wings outstretched and the damsel with her wings swept back is just that. That seems to be the difference. The damselflies tend to be tinier. Their larvae are different looking. The dragonfly larva is quite a fearsome predator as well. And see this diagram here shows this cool sort of flip out bottom jaw that it's got that flips out and grabs its prey and swallows it. It's also the stuff of the Alien movie, you know? So again, if you were a tiny minnow, not something you'd want to face. They also take tadpoles and insects, and they can live for a couple of seasons as nymphs, and they will come out onto a stalk of grass and split open in the back, and the adult comes out. They do not go through a pupa stage. Beetles go through a pupa stage. More modern insects go through that 4-stage life. The more ancient insects and some others as well tend to just have the 3 life stages: egg, larva, and adult. And so I think it's just so cool. Mayflies as well are in this group of Paleoptera, that most of the Paleoptera insects are extinct, but these continue. And what makes them special is they can't fold their wings, right? The dragons are fixed out, the damsels are fixed back, and the mayflies or the shadflies are fixed up. They don't fold. And that's one of the tells for Paleoptera. All the other insects are considered Neoptera. Oh, here's something else I found out about mayflies. I found this thing on my door, and I thought, what on earth is this? I took pictures of it, and it sure looked like a mayfly, but why would a mayfly be molting here? No, it would have done that in the water, climbed out of the water. Well, apparently mayflies have something called a subimago, which is sort of a teenage phase where their wings are a little more, they're not as clear, and they stay like that for a short time, and then they molt out of that into their adult form. So I think one did it on my door, and I'm pretty thrilled about that. And that's been there for weeks through rainstorms and everything. It's really quite wonderful. So there's just to show you the Carboniferous. That's where you would have found a lot of these insects. They would have been the size of hawks. They're carnivorous, and they are ancient. Then you got your flies, all your flies, all your flies. What I should point out here, I'm not going to go into the flies, but if the word fly is separate, then it's really a fly. And they're in the order Diptera. Di means 2. So they have 2 wings as opposed to 4 that most insects have. They have the second pair of wings has turned into these little knobs called halteres that are necessary for keeping their balance. Whereas dragonfly, butterfly, damselfly, that's all one word. So those aren't real flies. If it's a real fly, then the word fly is separate. Just keep in mind. And I think that's all I'm going to show you. Well, we got midges, we got, different kinds of flies, and mosquitoes are technically Diptera as well. They have 2 wings. They are in the order of flies. So I didn't find deer and horse and black flies, and there we go. I hope I haven't gone too much more than my 10 minutes.
That's good. Thank you, Andrea. I learned a lot. So, wait 1 second.
Back to you, Simon.
Oh,
No, I don't think I'm up. It's Jake.
It'll
it's
be me now.
Back to you, Jake.
Yeah. There we go. All right. let me know when you can see this. Well, I can start earlier because it's not actually relevant yet. So now I'm going to go through some of the native plants that we find in a wetland. There are so many species, but I'm specifically going to center around what we might find in the swale, specifically on our wetland awareness tour coming up. And then I'm going to touch on some of the challenges that each of these plants are facing, and therefore wetlands as a whole are facing. So first, I will mention that wetlands have an incredible amount of edible and medicinal plants in them. Like Simon mentioned, it is a biological supermarket, which has made them, along with shorelines in general, a very valuable place to settle close to throughout history with indigenous peoples, early settlers, and all around the world. So I will talk about some of the edible uses of some of these plants as well. So first, we will start with probably the most beautiful flower that I have ever seen in a, hold on a second. Okay. One of the most beautiful flowers that I've ever seen in a wetland, that is the white water lily, as well as the yellow water lily. But when I'm talking about the beautiful flower, I'm referring more to the white water lily because it is really incredible. So these water lilies play very, very important roles in the ecosystem of a wetland. They provide very important source of food for a lot of wildlife and insects. For example, all these lines that you see along the white water lily pads on the right are from a snail, are from all kinds of snails, just like, yeah, going along and munching their way along the leaf. And then there's also like other insects, deer, beavers, muskrats, and all other kinds of animals that are going to eat their rhizomes, which are like the roots or the tubes spreading underneath the ground with the little shoots shooting up from them. In fact, we can actually eat the rhizomes too. We can roast them, boil them, peel them, slice them. And this is often how we often ate them throughout history in soups and stews, along with a variety of other ways. And if you're daring enough to wade into the thick muck and reach down and grab one and pull it out. So with this, I will mention that there is a warning upon researching and finding out that you can't eat rhizomes, that eating them in large quantities is potentially poisonous. How much is a large quantity? I don't actually know. It didn't really mention. There doesn't seem to be a good source to find out these kinds of things. So as always, when I'm talking about these wild edibles, please do your own research and use your own proper discretion before you go out into the wild and just eat a whole bunch of some of these plants. One thing I will mention about the white water lily and the yellow water lily are when the flowers are not around, how you can differentiate these two are the yellow water lily on the left will have that more ovate heart-shaped flower, and then the white water lily on the right is going to have more of a round leaf. Sorry, ovate heart-shaped leaf. And then we can get into another really cool plant. So on the left, we have watermeal or wolfia. This is less than 1 millimeter wide. It is half the size of a grain of rice, and it is the world's smallest flowering plant. If you use a hand lens or somehow are able to view this really up close, there's a little tiny nub that sticks off of it that is technically deemed a flower. These are free-floating, rootless plants, and it will gather in bunches along with duckweed that we are seeing on the right. Now, these are about half a centimeter wide. That is the common duckweed that we see on the right. And these will, yeah, those ones have their roots dangling underneath, and you'll often see these two together gathering in bunches, playing a very important role. Like, they provide a great source of food for ducks and geese and other animals, including fish, reptiles, amphibians. They all take shelter under these thick mats or camouflage under these thick mats of wolfia or duckweed. And it can often be mistaken as algae because they're so small and it creates such a regular blanket of green. Now, because these plants tend to cover become very numerous in a small area, specifically in a area of shoreline or on people's ponds, people want to get rid of these by physically straining the water or by spraying this. And that also removes the immense benefits of duckweed that provides for the ecosystem. So now I'll talk about weed. Also a beautiful flower. These can populate very large patches throughout a wetland. And as you canoe through them, creates a very, very beautiful area to paddle through if you are there while it's in bloom. So these plants grow up to a couple feet high, and they have one large leaf with a purple flower. And these big leaves provide very important shelter for aquatic animals. And they also, another cool thing about this plant is that they have a very high rate of photosynthesis, and they create food and energy for a lot of food and energy for the entire ecosystem. They play an important role. And the seed is eaten by a variety of ducks, geese, muskrats, and we can also eat those starchy seeds as well. We can fry them, dry them, or roast them, or ground them into a powder. And then another plant I want to speak about is sweetgale. So this is one of my favorite plants that I can find in a wetland. It's about 1 meter tall, with a green leaf, with an elliptic leaf, and they also have catkins that are really short and stubby. And if you ground up one of these catkins or one of these leaves in your hand and smell it, that's a great way to be able to identify one of these plants, because it has a very sweet scent that is similar to like meadowsweet, but you're going to find these more often in a wetland. And a cool fact about this is it is the sole ingredient in Algonquin tea company's Lucid Dream tea. And I've tried it. It works. It's really cool. And if you want to try it, it tastes great and it's interesting to observe. And then there's jewelweed, otherwise known as touch-me-not, due to the fact that these seed pods will have a coil in it. And when the mature seed pod, when you touch the matured seed pods, they will actually explode and shoot the seeds all over the place, including all over you. It's fun to prank people who aren't expecting it with that. So it also has a bright orange, red, and pale yellow flower with 3 petals, and it's part of a family of plants that is closely related to carnivorous plants. So while this one is not carnivorous itself, its flower looks like that. Its flower looks like other plants that are carnivorous. And if you come on tour with us in a week and a half, I will show you something really cool that you can see if you put this plant underwater.
And
I don't want to build it. Yeah. So the edible uses for this. So again, with this one, exercise a high degree of caution, because when this plant is consumed in any great quantity, it can cause serious illness and even death. So if it's eaten raw. So you need to cook it well, and it can, in 2 changes of water, boiling it for 10 to 15 minutes, you can actually eat this and it tastes similar to green beans. So this is also, interestingly, grows in the same area as poison ivy. So if you do get hit by poison ivy or start to feel the oil or the burning of poison ivy, you can mush some of this up in your hand and rub it over your, it can be poison oak burn, razor burn, stinging nettle burn, or poison ivy, or any kind of skin irritation. It'll help out with that.
What's
Then
it
there's
called again? What's it
jewelweed.
One more
Jewelweed or touch-me-not. Like, so yeah, it goes by both names. Yeah, and then so now there's northern wild rice. So this plant has this, we won't actually really find in the swale. It's in a river close by. Simon, you mentioned the name. I forget what river that is. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Irish Creek near Jasper is one place.
Okay.
And also where the Tay and the Rideau meet.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So this wild rice has played in especially significant role culturally and economically with the indigenous peoples. They would have had bountiful harvests of this plant, and it would have been a principal food source a long time ago. But now with the modern conditions of our wetlands and rivers, it is becoming increasingly scarce, and it is actually quite a fragile plant. It is very vulnerable to fluctuating water levels, which in fact, with the, like Simon said, with the moderated water levels of the Rideau waterway, this can actually be a benefit, but it is very susceptible to the pollution in the waters and the rivers. And yeah, so the increasing pollution in our rivers today are not well suited for this rice crop. And also climate change is a big problem for this plant because it's well suited to a hardier, colder northern climate. And here, well, yeah, we just keep getting warmer and warmer. So then, oh, one moment. Cattails. So cattails are one of the main wetland plants that you are going to find. You can also find them along shorelines, in ditches. They are really easy to identify with their long sword-like leaves, as well as their well-known flower, their brown long flower. And they don't always flower, but we actually find big sections of cattails that don't flower, and I can't understand why. But anyways, these ones do. And so you find two main varieties, common and narrow leaf. Common is the one that we're going to find the most, with a wider flower. And the ecological importance of this cattail is incredible. Many shoreline birds will nest within cattails, including the red-winged blackbird, which is the nest that we see here with eggs in it, and marsh wren. I couldn't find a picture of this, but it's more of a ball nest in amongst the cattails. Muskrats will make their lodges out of sticks, not out of sticks, but out of this vegetation, out of these cattails, especially the cattail mats. They'll go underneath and make what's called a push-up. So they'll push up the mat and form their lodge underneath that mat. And these provide also excellent safe habitat for small fish and aquatic creatures, and a lot of wildlife will feed on them. It also has a rich range of edible and practical uses. It is one of my favorite edibles. Most wild edibles have a very fibrous, not easy to digest kind of taste about them, but this one is actually surprisingly delicious. I'm going to go into more on that if you come along with us on the wetland awareness tour soon. So a challenge that cattails are facing is they obstruct property owners' view. They will spray them or physically remove them to improve their access or views to the waterway. And yeah, so another big challenge cattails are facing is invasive species, and purple loosestrife is a big invasive species posing a major threat to this. And I'll now go into details on this plant as well as other plants, invasive species that we'll find in our wetlands today. So purple loosestrife is about 1 meter tall. It is a shrub-like plant covered in downy hairs. It has tall purple flowers with kind of a pointy top. It arrived early in the 20th century with European sailboats in the ballast, and now it has spread far and wide all over North America and has really taken over. There's actually an estimated 450,000 acres in North America of wetland, marshes, pasture, and meadows that are affected by the purple loosestrife. You can see on the right here, there's just a pasture that is covered with purple loosestrife, completely taken over that habitat, as well as wetland habitats significantly. The mature plant can produce up to 2.7 million seeds, which has made it incredibly hard to control. Yeah. And so a black margin loosestrife beetle has been released about 20 years ago, which eats purple loosestrife. So you no longer see, well, I don't know if that's accurate, but the Ontario website says you no longer see big stands of it taking over wetlands. The beetle cannot fly very far, so it cannot spread great in distances. So therefore humans have to actually manually introduce them to new locations. And then another one is the Phragmites. So there is a native form of Phragmites that is smaller and non-invasive, but the ones that we're going to see most often all over the place on the side of highways, completely taking over wetlands, is the invasive Phragmites. In fact, in my school program, in my outdoor adventure naturalist program, our teacher brought us into a stand of Phragmites, and it was like a really dense jungle trying to find my way through these hardy plants that grow up to 6 meters tall and completely take over. And so they grow really close together. They're very dense. And in addition to this, they actually inject poisonous chemicals into the ground so other plants cannot grow around them. So it's a huge problem. They get introduced to an area, they completely take over the wetland. They're posing a major threat to our native wetland species, especially the cattails. And in addition to this, they don't really provide any good nutrients or food sources for any kind of native wildlife. And they will actually consume water and evaporate it at a very rapid rate into the air. And so that removes water from other plants that would otherwise have it. Then there's European frogbit. This is a small lily pad-like leaf. You can see it. That duckweed is about 0.5 centimeter in diameter, and the leaf itself of this one is about 6 centimeters wide. It was actually introduced to the experimental farm in Ottawa in 1932, and in 1939 it was found in the Rideau Canal, and since then it has spread all over the Rideau River, in Ottawa and St. Lawrence Rivers, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie. Yeah, it's all over the place. And all three of these invasive species we will find on our tour if we go looking for them in the swale. They are literally everywhere. So now, this is a major challenge, but I want to talk about some of the environmental benefits of wetlands. So wetlands will absorb and hold vast amounts of water when there is an excess, and it will slowly release that water to significantly help the ecosystem when it is in drought. Wetlands will also slow the flow of water as it moves through the wetland and increase the amount of water that gets infiltrated into the soil. So this significantly reduces the risk of flooding, and it allows for a more regulated distribution of water through the river and through the wetlands. Wetlands will also filter out excess pollutants from cities or nutrients from agriculture, especially cattails. So cattails will filter these pollutants, runoff, sewage, and fertilizers through their thread-like roots that are often floating on the water, creating a dense mat or a mesh that is really helping filter out a lot of these excess nutrients. In fact, it is important to note that wetlands provide a significant community economic benefit by improving water quality and filtering out these pollutants in a natural way. This saves local governments a very large amount of money by reducing the need for water treatment plants. For example, New York City invested $600 million in nature-based solutions to improve and conserve its 19 water reservoirs, ability to keep the water clean and have proper drainage. And some of these nature-based solutions included the rehabilitation of wetland plants, and this investment provided the same level of service and water quality, which $6 billion in water treatment plants would have provided, saving the city effectively over $5 billion. So this nature-based solutions with wetlands is an incredible opportunity for us to take advantage of in the future. And then there, of course, is the carbon sequestration of wetlands. This is true for all wetlands, especially peatlands, which constitute less than 3% of the Earth's surface, while sequestering about 30% of the annually sequestered carbon dioxide in the world. They sequester double the amount of carbon dioxide than a forest can sequester, and wetland plants are especially effective at sequestering this carbon because, unlike trees or above ground plants, when they die, they fall over, they decompose with the air, and most of their carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. But in peatlands and in wetlands, when those plants die, they get covered up with new plants, and the part of those plants that go underwater, well, they don't really decompose. It's very, very slow process, and this carbon will build up underneath and be stored in very high quantities. However, when humans drain wetlands, this allows billions of tons of carbon to be emitted back into the atmosphere through decomposition, and the world's wetlands are being destroyed and drained at a very alarming rate. So I will also, so according to Canadian Geographic, agriculture expansion is responsible for about 85% of Canada's wetland loss. And in Southern Ontario alone, more than 70% of wetlands have disappeared or been destroyed by roads, farmlands, housing, and industry. So they are really in a crisis. So we must really work hard to regenerate our wetlands and work towards policy which can allow wetlands to be restored. Unfortunately, I'm not that knowledgeable about the ways we can personally help with policies, but I do know one way that we can help, which is with shoreline naturalization. And you can do this in a variety of ways. And one of those ways is by implementing wetland plants. So I'll get into shoreline naturalization a little bit now. So if you are a homeowner with, there are two ways you can naturalize your shoreline. You can allow the shoreline and wetland plants growing to just be, don't remove them, establish a no-mow zone, and that simple act will allow natural habitat to return. Or you can take a more active approach and plant your own species of plants along your shoreline and in the water if you wish, but that gets a little bit more complicated. You can simply allow any plants that do arise along your shoreline to remain, and naturally it'll grow in with wetland plants. And there are other things you can do to help that process along. But if you are interested in taking this approach, RVCA, or Rideau Valley Conservation Authority, has a wealth of resources online that you can use to find out more about both of these active and passive approaches. And they also have a shoreline naturalization program, which they can provide the expertise in both the planning and the planting process. And they will even help plant the plants for you and buy the plants. You just need to pay for it. So you can visit their website to see more about the shoreline naturalization program. And the Rideau Roundtable is one last thing I will mention. Our shoreline naturalization project coming on September 25th of 2021, so next month. This is a picture of Lower Reach Park. This is the shoreline of the area that we are doing our shoreline plant on. As you can see, it very much needs a rehabilitation. There's a lot of shoreline plants to be planted here. And as we do this, it will allow more of those plants to creep into the water and provide critical habitat for the river wildlife as well. So yeah, you can contact me for the details. If you're interested in joining us for the shoreline plant, you can email me or call me and I can get you set up to help volunteer on this day of this shoreline plant. And then there is one last thing I will mention, the Wetland Awareness Tour Day happening on Sunday, August 22nd. So 2 Sundays from now, and we are going to have tours leaving from the Bascule Bridge by the boat launch at 10 a.m., 11:30 a.m., 1:30 p.m., and 3 p.m. And on each of these tours, they're going to be about an hour long. We're going to explore the wetland more, talk about some more benefits that we receive from the wetlands, and take a closer look at some of the plants and hopefully see a lot of this wildlife that we spoke about in this presentation in closer. So again, if you want to book one of these tours, you can email me or call me with this contact information below. I'm going to send it to everybody. I'm going to send it to everybody in the follow-up email for this presentation, everyone who has registered. So,
Yeah, Jay, just want to follow up about the shoreline restoration one. We have a corporate sponsor, Cogeco TV or yours TV, who is actually helping to turn this video into a YouTube video that would be available to more people. Yeah.
Excellent. Awesome. Cool. So that is everything I have. Oh, yeah. So that's going to take place in the swale, like what Simon was showing before. This is the swale area that we're going to be paddling through, leaving from the Basque Bridge over here and exploring, do a little bit of short exploration around and see what we can find. So there is the wetland awareness presentation. And now, yeah, I first want to, yeah, we did go 10 minutes over the hour, so I apologize for keeping you for longer. But yeah, it was great to have you all join us. And if you do need to take off, that is fine. But otherwise, we can stick around and people can ask questions if you have any.
One of the questions I wanted to ask about the cattails, is Parks Canada doing any harvesting of the cattails to get any of the heavy metals out of the waterway?
Does anyone know the answer to that question?
One small thing I can share, and this is quite dated, but when I was still working with the canal, about 20 years ago, there was a project down Cataraqui River section, just up from Kingston on the Rideau Canal. And there was a big point of land there that was a landfill. And part of their remediation that was involved, they used cattails for some of the plantings and so on. It was incredible. One thing I remember happening there is that they fenced off an area where the effluent was coming out and the area they were planting some remediation. And they put bags of hay that they used as basking platforms for any turtles that were caught within this impounded area. And I remember seeing in the space of 15 minutes about 150 huge painted turtles that it's one of those examples. You can go to areas like this and you just don't appreciate what is there. In this case, underwater, the turtles obviously didn't have enough areas to bask, but they were there. Amazing. But anyway, that's one spot that the township of Kingston and Parks Canada, we had some involvement with that, but that's the only thing I'm aware of locally.
Your hand over him. Go ahead.
Simon, it's Ron
Yeah.
Stronsky calling. How are you? I'd
Fine,
like
thanks. Hi, Ron.
to thank everybody for a wonderful presentation tonight. Simon, I have a question for you. I've lived on Lower Reach for almost 75 years. I was brought up here and so on. And we used to have a tremendous amount of of the bullfrogs in the area, but now I don't hear any. Can you tell me what's happened to them? Or do you have any idea?
I can't tell you what's happened except to say that there was a bit more of a healthy wetland environment if you go back in time in Lower Swale or the Lower Reach Park area. Bullfrogs are one of those indicator species. They're like canaries in the coal mine, that when you find areas that have good bullfrog populations, it's often, and in fact, even usually, an indication that that area is in pretty good shape. But in terms of Lower Reach, I mean, you've had in spite of, for instance, R.E.A.L's past activities with native plantings along the shoreline, and you've got a lot of use taking place in Lower Reach Park. They did a lot, Parks Canada, in fact, did a lot of remediation from the iron that was leaching out from the old dump, because the park itself used to be a large wetland and was used for many years in the decades ago as as a dump site. And so it was remediated since then. And in spite of all one's efforts to totally stop any, and I won't say effluent, but any leaching chemicals that partly shouldn't be coming out in great quantities, it's hard to necessarily totally eliminate everything. So I'd say it's kind of a combination of things, heavy recreational use. The shoreline isn't as healthy. It is and it isn't as it has been in the past. Do you have any suggestions yourself, Ron? You got any thoughts about what might have made a difference from your perspective?
Simon, I do. And if I could just elaborate a bit on my shoreline here off of Queen Street, almost right up to the old Canadian Tire store, maybe even to the motel. The two factories that were there, the Frost and Woods and the malleable castings, and my shoreline is completely covered with slag from those factories all the way down to where Cowan's Dairy was pretty well.
Yes.
So probably that would have an effect on the bullfrogs and other species in my area here. And it's very disturbing because I've lived here, as I said, for 70 years or better. And I haven't seen very much success in that little territory that I just mentioned.
Yeah, it might take quite a lot in that specific area, because you're right, there was a lot of buried materials and everything all along that section. It might be hard to get them back without some real major efforts. It's the case where maybe it doesn't help you in your location, but maybe there are a few other areas where the impacts aren't as great, but by doing some remediation, you can bring bullfrog populations back a little bit. I don't have a solution for you, I'm afraid, Ron. It's one of those things that was a precious thing in the past, and we've lost it, at least for the near future.
Simon, just to add to that, we have a lot of waterfowl on our property down here, so we're very happy with that.
Yes. So well, there you go. You lose one way and gain in another. Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I wanted to mention, if somebody hasn't got a direct question quickly, is that in terms of the swale. Oh, go ahead, Andrea. Go ahead.
Well, it may be, you might be about to answer it. I was just curious whether the jewelweed and the cattails, where the warnings were related to modern pollution being absorbed, or were they always in pristine days? Would they always have been a little bit toxic? So that was my question. And the other thing I'd just like to say before we leave later on, if everybody turned on their camera, assuming they're clothed, we could do a screen grab with everybody smiling and document everyone's presence. So there's my question.
Jake, do you have any comments on cattails?
In terms of cat, I know the jewelweed actually produces a chemical within its plant that forms crystals that are toxic within your body. So that one would have always been toxic. And in terms of the cat, are you talking about like maybe the rhizomes of the water lilies? Yeah. Okay. That one. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that.
There's one thing, this isn't related to your question, I'm afraid, Andrea, except that the touch me not, the little seed pods of what Jake was talking about, how they explode. It's great to show kids. Kids go nuts when you just touch those pods and they explode right in front of them. And it's another great thing for taking kids on a walk. As far as I know, that plant has been around for a long, long time, and it grows quite profusely in not many swamp areas, the edges of swamps, many stream edges, floodplain areas. In my travels, there's lots of it around in general.
one plant that is also a touch me not, and I wonder if you can,
Yeah.
it is the Himalayan balsam, and that is growing in my garden. I've been trying to manage it for years, but it is all along the shoreline in Merrickville,
Oh,
and it's highly invasive. The plant is can grow to 8 feet. They're really gorgeous, beautiful orchid-like flowers, exactly like our little jewelweed, but bigger and pinker. In England, they call these policeman's helmet. And the bumblebees love them. They are loaded apparently with more and richer nectar than our native plants. And so in fact, they take the bees away from our native plants, which is a bummer. And the problem with them on a shoreline is that they have a very tiny little root mass. They're really easy to pull. And so they take over because they have big leaves. And so they shade everything else out, take over the shoreline. And then because they don't have a decent root mass, they don't hold on to the soil. And so erosion is happening. And so that's another plant to keep an eye out for and to yank it. And the seed pod is a touch me not as well. Its adaptation to winter, or, I discovered this. It's a long story. I won't go into it. But anyway, suffice it to say, it's got a really clever way of spreading its seed. When the frost makes the ice in the cells break, the cell walls break, the stem folds in half, it knocks its head onto its knees, it opens the seed pods and they spread like crazy. So one night I actually heard this crack, whap, crack, whap, as millions of seeds were scattering, and it's a biannual self-seeder. And so you have to keep on it.
you must have had nightmares after that. One thing I mentioned, another invasive, it's one of these things that you get a few benefits, but a lot of drawbacks too with some of the invasives. Loosestrife. There are beekeepers that make wonderful honey from loosestrife. And there are some of these invasives, it's a problem in itself. Some pollinators, some of the natural bees and wasps, love going to cow parsnip, for instance, and you'll see them with lots of native pollinators getting nectar. Well, it's good for the pollinators, but it's not good for the spread of the plant, although, that plant's going to spread like crazy anywhere. And so loosestrife, the same thing. You see certain kinds of insects making use of it, and honeybees in particular.
And we do have a native loosestrife apparently, which is not quite so invasive that people.
Yeah, there's a swamp loosestrife that you see along a lot of the shorelines and along the river and marshy areas, for instance.
Very alarmed to see that in Kingston, where there's been this huge and uninterrupted, gorgeous cattail mat at the mouth of the Cataraqui River, has recently, because of the work that they've done on the highway, widening the 401, the Phragmites has made an inroad. Yeah. And I'm just wondering how long it'll be before we lose that perfect marsh. Anyway.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
You may like to share that on September the 7th, for Watersheds Canada is hosting another of the sessions that we had before, that of plastics in our waterways.
Yeah. Yeah, so go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, don't be shy. You can hire the Rideau Roundtable Robasca canoe for you and your family to go for tours in the Swale or in the other direction out of Old Sly's Lock, or just noodle around in the basin anytime that we're not down in Gananoque, where you can also come to the Gananoque Boat Museum and climb aboard the 2 big Voyageur canoes that are operating out of there mostly for the season. And there we go into the Admiralty group of islands in the Thousand Islands at Gananoque. And it's a great tour. And you really, when you're out in the big water, you really feel like a voyager.
Yeah. And one other thing too is that if you are familiar with homeschooling, there's actually a group of parents now actually encouraging and getting their kids into studying the species at risk and so on. So they're having exploratory voyager trips and so on. They want to get more of those things. So interested, let us know so we can get you involved with that. Okay.
Just out of interest for those of us left in this meeting together, how many of you have been to the swale? Any? Okay, so you know, probably half of you. Anyway, that's great. Yeah. One thing I will mention, I find in terms of, I kind of alluded to the best time to go. I find that certainly in the early morning, prior to say 10 o'clock or so, that's when things tend to be most active, although certain birds and other animals are active throughout the day. And later on in the day, you'll often see different birds bring in their young ones. In terms of the time of year, I find June is probably, if I had to pick 1 month to see the most activity. Many of the waterfowl are early breeders. They'll have their young ones out, and that can stretch into the month of July, certainly till mid-July, late July. You still have a lot of broods of waterfowl and other birds. Although, quite frankly, if you spend any time in the summer is a good time when you're out on the water. You'll find something of interest.
Also, a lot of awesome flowers in bloom in June, late June specifically.
Yes. Yeah.
So is that the end? No more questions or comments?
So make sure that you don't want to miss out on the wetland awareness tour in the big Voyager canoe. Okay, it's a lot of interesting things are waiting for you.
Yes, I will be sure to send you the details tomorrow to everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us
everyone.
again tonight.
Bye.
And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. And we'll see
Thank
you
you.
2 Sundays from now.
Shall we do a screen grab? Everybody turn on their camera if they're decent.
Okay. Okay.
I have.
Okay.
Sure.
There we go.
Good,
There's
good, good.
Anita.
Yeah.
Is
Where's
somebody
Terry?
doing the screen grab or
Hi,
should
Anita.
I?
Okay.
Okay, we're missing Norma and Mary. That's okay. All right. 1, 2, 3, big smile. Good.
Okay, great. Yeah. And actually, I saw one of our members from Vancouver joining us in this session. Ruth Ain, for those of you who live in Smith Falls, you remember she being one of the council members. Okay. So she's now, she joins us tonight from Vancouver. Okay, great.
How exciting.
Yeah.
Nice to
Thanks
see
for
you.
everyone.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
folks.
Good
Yeah.
night.
Mentioned Anita Payne is our local Green candidate. Yes, Anita, will you be running again in the next election?
Oh, we have a new candidate, Calvin Neufeld from Perth
Yeah.
is our Green candidate.
Okay. Well, it's been great having you as our candidate.
Thank you.
Okay, good night. Yeah.
Good night, everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Jake,
Yep.
Jake and Andrea, could you stay on for just a moment?
Mhm.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Peter. Bye, Peter.
Okay,
Um,
bye-bye. Oh, sorry.
Thanks for the coordination, Peter.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, here you go.
Jake and Andrea, I just wanted to say great job. Andrea, fascinating, very fascinating.
Good.
And Jake, your manner is very, very good presentation style as well.
Thank you very
I
much.
learned a lot from both of you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. It was a joy to listen to you. Like, yeah, I've definitely learned a lot about the wildlife too.
It looks to me, I wish I knew how to use this better, because I would have notes in front so that I wouldn't forget so much. Like it looks like you're able to do that with the proper setup of more than one screen. But as you go through, you kick yourself for not, I'm talking about myself, for not saying obvious things and important things, not even mentioning the word peat for bogs, for instance, but hey, that's the way it goes. Anyway, I found both your presentations just great. Thank you so much. It's a
And
pleasure to.
yours wonderful too. So there we go. We all learned something that, you know, that we didn't know before. And I found you very smooth, both of you, very smooth, not redundant. It was very informative and smooth, I guess is what I would say. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Were we cutting out at all? I noticed, Andrea, and with mine, you were cutting out sometimes.
I didn't notice that.
You didn't notice that.
No.
Isn't that funny? Did you find that I was cutting out?
Not really.
But and yet those sounds that recordings you played, everybody else heard them, did they?
Well,
Just
they
fine?
were very faint.
They're faint. Okay, so
Okay.
Yeah.
anyway,
So you have to share in a special way when you're going to try and do audio. So
yeah.
it's
It's
tricky.
a tough one, because you know, if it's not working and you don't know for sure whether it's working, it's taken up valuable time.
Yeah.
Now I'm sorry if I kind of moved on with it, Jake. But anyway,
No,
good
No.
work, Jake.
Yeah.
Great work
The
on
whole thing went
Jake
really
too.
well.
We're getting it
I
together.
don't know if I took more than 10 minutes, but I didn't feel rushed, and I appreciate that I just got to finish the Odonata, which is what I wanted to do. And
Yeah,
I
I
thought the
think it was.
pace was nice, I thought, throughout. And
Yeah, for sure. I think if I would change anything, it would be like the transitions kind of at the end. It didn't feel like it kind of flowed in the second half of my part, but it seemed
Oh,
to
you
be.
did
seemed to
well. I thought it went really well. I mean, you were very measured in the pace of your comments, and you were very good at bringing constant points out as you went along. You're easy and pleasant to listen to. Yeah, no, good one on you. And
Okay.
and
Thank
and
you.
Andrea, I learned so much from
Yeah.
what you were saying. It was really
Absolutely.
interesting.
oh, really? Oh,
Listening to- yeah.
I learned a lot just researching, and I must say I've spent the last 3
Well,
days of my life researching.
Well, you put a lot of work into. You made up all those slides yourself. And,
Yeah.
yeah, good. Wow, it's a lot of work, a lot more work than I put into mine. So anyway, congrats. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation.
So it was time spent, and now I assume I can take the presentation and use it elsewhere for you know, yeah.
Mhm.
And likewise, your photos are glorious, Simon. Were those all photographs that you had taken?
Yeah, the ones that I was talking with. I
Sorry,
think there might.
Simon. I forgot to mention that most of my photos came from you.
Oh,
I was
don't
gonna
worry
mention
about
that,
it.
but I
In fact,
forgot.
what I wanted to mention to you, if you have a reason to need photos, any of those photos excuse, frog in my throat.
Mhm.
If you need to use any of those photos for some reason for future, feel free. I don't
Oh.
need credit. I
Okay.
usually say to people, if it's convenient to give credit, fine, but don't worry if you don't. And I just like sharing, so.
Thank you, Simon.
No
That's
problem.
very
You're-
nice.
You're welcome.
I appreciate
And if you
that.
ever need any other photos, as I said before, you can always ask. I won't guarantee, but I'll do what I can to help you out.
Okay.
Okay, no
Thank
strings attached. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well-
And likewise for you, of course, Andrea, if you ever need any.
Thank you. Yeah, I must say it towards the end, I was just grabbing them off Wikipedia
Yeah.
and throwing them in,
Yeah.
but most of the
Yeah.
time I was keeping track of my sources, and
Yeah.
it's remarkable how many other people have done exactly this presentation. I mean, I was
Yeah.
mining stuff from other people's presentations, you know, but not
Yeah.
slideshows. So that is that's different. Lots
Yeah.
is published and videos, but
With this, it's being put on YouTube, was mentioned, was it?
I think
Okay.
on Kojiko TV, yeah.
Ecological, okay, so will a link or a notice be sent out at some point so that I'd like to watch parts of it because on my computer, parts of Andrea were cutting out as I mentioned, and I'd like to listen to it again.
Yeah, there's going to be a link to the recording of this Zoom session
Yeah.
sent out tomorrow in the email.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, good job,
yeah.
both of you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Good night.
much.
No,
Good
you're
night.
welcome.
Consider yourself beard.
Yeah,
We'll
okay.
toast one day.
Cheers. Yeah.
Cheers.
Night.
Bye.